When I discovered my husband and my mother had been sleeping together for 13 years, my first reaction wasn't tears. It wasn't screaming. It wasn't even the rage you'd expect from a woman whose entire world had just shattered into a million pieces. My first reaction was laughter. Not the joyful kind, but that hollow, almost hysterical sound that comes from somewhere deep inside when your mind simply cannot process what it's being told. I laughed because the alternative was to completely lose my sanity right there in my own kitchen, standing in front of the two people I had loved and trusted more than anyone else in this world. My name is Barbara Ann Evans, and I'm 70 years old now. I live in Cleveland, Ohio, in the same modest brick house on Maple Avenue, where I raised my 3 children and spent 43 years building what I thought was a solid, loving marriage. 3 years have passed since that October afternoon when everything I believed about my life turned out to be a carefully constructed lie. And I'm here today to tell you this story, not because I want your pity, but because I learned something profound in those dark months that followed. The truth will always find its way to the surface, no matter how deeply it's buried, and sometimes the people who hurt you the most are the ones standing closest to your heart. Before I dive into what happened and how I eventually found my way through it, I want to ask you for just a small favor. This channel shares real stories from women like me, grandmothers who've lived through things we never imagined we'd face. These stories are completely free for you to watch, and they exist to remind you that you're not alone, whatever you might be going through. If you could take just 1 second to hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell, it would mean the world to me and help these stories reach other women who might need to hear them. And if this story resonates with you at all, a quick like really does help more than you might think. Also, I'd love to know where you're watching from, so drop a comment telling me what city or country you're in and what you think as this story unfolds. Your support helps this channel grow and reach people who need to know they're not alone. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being here and for listening. I was born in Cleveland in 1954, right in the heart of the working-class neighborhoods where Lake Erie's cold winds sweep through every winter and people take pride in hard work and keeping their word. My father, Henry Morrison, worked at the Ford plant on Brook Park Road for 38 years, and my mother, Ruth Morrison, kept our home running with the kind of efficiency that would make a military sergeant envious. We weren't rich, not by any stretch, but we had everything we needed: a roof over our heads, food on the table, and parents who showed up for every school play and parent-teacher conference without fail. I grew up in a small 2-bedroom house on West 45th Street, sharing a room with my younger sister Linda until I left for community college at 18. The neighborhood was the kind where everyone knew everyone else's business, where you could leave your front door unlocked, and where summer evenings meant kids playing kick the can until the street lights came on. My mother was the unofficial queen of our block, always organizing potlucks, always the first to show up with a casserole when someone got sick or had a baby. She had this way of making everyone feel special, of making you feel like you were the most important person in the room when she turned her attention to you. My father was quieter, more reserved, but solid as Lake Erie bedrock. He taught me how to change a tire, how to check the oil in a car, how to stand up for myself without being cruel. He'd come home every evening at 5:30, wash his hands at the kitchen sink with that orange pumice soap that smelled like industrial citrus, and sit down to whatever my mother had prepared. They weren't overly affectionate in front of us kids, but there was a steadiness to their relationship, a foundation that I grew up believing was what real love looked like. I met Charles Evans in 1970, when I was 16 years old, at a church picnic at Edgewater Park. He was 18, freshly graduated from James Ford Rhodes High School, with sandy brown hair that fell across his forehead and a smile that made my stomach do flips. He worked at his uncle's auto repair shop on Lorraine Avenue and had dreams of eventually opening his own place. I was drawn to his confidence, to the way he seemed to know exactly what he wanted from life. He was kind to my parents, respectful to my father, charming to my mother in that wholesome way that made older women smile and say things like, "You've got a good one there, Barbara." We dated for 4 years before getting married in 1974. I was 20, he was 22, and we were so naively certain that love was all you needed to build a life together. The wedding was small, held at St. Coleman Church on West 65th Street, with a reception in the church basement, where my mother and her friends had decorated with crepe paper streamers and homemade flower arrangements. Charles wore a brown suit that he'd saved up 3 months to buy, and I wore my mother's wedding dress, taken in at the waist and let out slightly in the bust to fit my frame. We honeymooned for 3 days at a cabin in Hocking Hills, then came back to Cleveland to start our real life together. Charles got a job as a mechanic at a Chevrolet dealership, and I worked as a secretary at a small insurance company downtown. We rented a tiny apartment on Detroit Avenue, barely big enough for the two of us, with a bathroom so small you had to step into the tub to close the door. But we were happy in that innocent, optimistic way young couples are when everything still feels like an adventure. We'd save up our pennies to go to the movies once a month. We'd have my parents over for Sunday dinner, even though our table only seated 4 people, and my cooking was mediocre at best. My father died in 1979 when I was 25. Heart attack at the plant, sudden and massive, gone before the ambulance even arrived. It devastated my mother in ways I didn't fully understand until much later. They'd been married for 32 years, and in an instant, her entire identity as someone's wife evaporated. She was only 56 years old, suddenly alone in that house on West 45th Street, surrounded by memories of a man who'd never raise his voice, never stay out late, never give her a single reason to doubt him. I became her anchor after that. My sister Linda had moved to Arizona with her husband, so I was the one who checked on Mom every day, who made sure she was eating properly, who held her hand through the grief. Charles was wonderful during that time, patient with my emotional absences, understanding when I'd spend entire Saturdays at my mother's house helping her sort through Dad's belongings or just sitting with her while she cried. He'd drive me over there, wait in the car, reading the Plain Dealer sports section, never complaining about the time it took. We bought our house on Maple Avenue in 1982, a modest brick ranch with 3 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, and a basement that constantly smelled slightly damp, no matter what we did. It needed work, but Charles was handy and we were determined. Our first child, Jennifer, was born in 1983. Then came Michael in 1985, and finally Sarah in 1988. My mother was ecstatic to be a grandmother, showing up at the hospital within hours of each birth, with hand-knitted blankets and tears streaming down her face. She became an integral part of our lives in those years. She'd babysit at least twice a week, so Charles and I could have date nights. Though usually we were so exhausted we'd just go to dinner at a local diner and be back home by 8:30. She'd come over for Sunday dinners, always bringing her famous potato salad or her chocolate cake that the kids would beg for all week. She'd take the kids to the zoo, to the library, to the park, giving me precious hours to catch up on laundry or just breathe. Charles and my mother got along beautifully. She'd often say how lucky I was to have found such a good man, how my father would have approved of him. Charles would fix things around her house without being asked, would shovel her driveway in winter before even doing our own, would sit and listen to her stories about my father with genuine interest. I remember thinking how blessed I was to have a husband who truly loved my mother, who treated her with such kindness and respect. The years passed in that comfortable, predictable rhythm that defines middle-class American life. Charles eventually left the dealership and opened his own small repair shop in 1995, fulfilling that dream he'd had since we first met. It was a modest operation, just him and 2 employees, tucked into a small garage bay on West 117th Street. The business did well enough to keep us comfortable, though we were never wealthy. We took occasional vacations to Myrtle Beach or the Smoky Mountains. We helped the kids with college tuition as best we could. We paid our mortgage on time every month. My mother aged gracefully, staying active and independent well into her 70s and 80s. She lived alone in that same house on West 45th Street until she was 85, when I finally convinced her to move into a senior apartment complex on Madison Avenue. It was closer to us, had an emergency pull cord system, and most importantly, it meant I wouldn't worry quite so much about her falling or having a medical emergency with no one around to help. The kids grew up and moved away. Jennifer married a lawyer and moved to Columbus. Michael became a high school teacher and settled in Lakewood, just 20 minutes away. Sarah went to nursing school and ended up in Pittsburgh. Our house grew quieter. The bedrooms that once echoed with teenage music and arguments now silent and still. Charles and I settled into the routines of empty nesters. Morning coffee together while reading separate sections of the newspaper, early bird dinners at local restaurants, weekends spent doing yard work or visiting the grandkids. I trusted Charles completely. In 40 years of marriage, I'd never had a single reason to doubt him. He'd never come home smelling of perfume, never had unexplained absences, never acted secretive about his phone or his whereabouts. If anything, he was almost boring in his predictability. Up at 6 every morning, home by 6:30 every evening, asleep by 10 every night. Our sex life had slowed to almost nothing in our 60s, but I'd assumed that was just age and familiarity, the natural cooling that happens to most long-married couples. And my mother, my beautiful, devoted mother, had been my rock my entire life. She was the one I called when I needed advice, when I was frustrated with the kids, when I just needed to hear a loving voice tell me I was doing okay. She was at every single birthday party, every holiday dinner, every important moment in our family's life. She'd held my hand through 3 difficult labors, through my father's death, through the scary years when Sarah had struggled with depression in high school. She was, in my mind, the definition of unconditional love. The thought that these 2 people, the husband I'd built a life with and the mother who'd given me life, could betray me in such a fundamental, devastating way had literally never crossed my mind. Not once in all those years. Not even for a fleeting second. Which is exactly why, when the truth finally came crashing down, it felt less like a revelation and more like waking up in a completely different reality, where everything I'd known was suddenly terrifyingly false. Looking back now, with the cruel clarity that hindsight provides, I can see the signs. They were there all along, scattered through the years like breadcrumbs I was too trusting to follow. At the time, I explained away every single odd moment, rationalized every inconsistency, because the alternative was simply unthinkable. But the truth has a weight to it, and eventually, that weight becomes impossible to ignore. The first time something felt off was in the summer of 2011. I was 57 years old, and Charles had just turned 59. We'd been invited to a cookout at our neighbor's house, the Kowalskis, who lived 3 doors down. It was a humid Saturday afternoon, the kind where the air feels thick enough to swim through, and I'd spent the morning making my mother's famous coleslaw recipe to bring along. Charles had been at the shop all morning working on a rush job for a regular customer, and he'd called to say he'd be home by 2 so we could walk over together. He arrived home at 1:30 instead, which was unusual. Charles ran his life by the clock, always had. I was upstairs changing into a clean blouse when I heard the front door open and his footsteps on the stairs. When he came into our bedroom, his hair was damp, like he'd just showered, and he had that freshly scrubbed look that men get when they've washed in a hurry. "You're early," I said, smiling at him in the mirror as I buttoned my blouse. "Finished faster than you thought." There was the briefest hesitation, so quick I almost missed it before he nodded. "Yeah, it wasn't as complicated as I expected. Figured I'd clean up at the shop instead of rushing here." Something about the way he said it felt rehearsed, like he'd practiced the explanation on the drive home. But I pushed the thought away immediately. Why would Charles need to rehearse an explanation for coming home early? I was being ridiculous, probably just nervous about the cookout, because I wasn't great in large social gatherings and always felt a bit awkward at neighborhood events. The cookout itself was pleasant enough. Charles was charming and social, talking cars with the men and making the women laugh with his stories from the shop. My mother was there too, which was common since the Kowalskis had known her for years and often invited her to their gatherings. At one point, I was standing by the food table refilling my iced tea when I glanced over and saw Charles and my mother talking near the Kowalskis' garden shed. It wouldn't have registered as anything unusual except for the way they were standing. Closer than casual conversation required. And my mother had her hand on his forearm in a gesture that seemed almost intimate. I watched them for maybe 10 seconds before Mrs. Kowalski asked me something about the coleslaw recipe, and I turned my attention away. When I looked back, they'd separated and were mingling with other guests. I felt a tiny flutter of something in my chest, something uncomfortable I couldn't quite name. But then I reasoned it away. They were family, they'd known each other for decades. Of course they'd be comfortable with each other. I was being silly, seeing things that weren't there. The second sign came about 8 months later, in March of 2012. I'd been fighting a terrible flu, the kind that leaves you weak and shaky, unable to keep anything down. I'd been sick for 4 days, mostly in bed, when I ran out of ginger ale, which was the only thing that seemed to settle my stomach even slightly. Charles was at work, and I didn't want to bother him over something so trivial, so I called my mother. "Honey, of course I'll bring you some," she said immediately. "I'll be there in 20 minutes. She showed up in 15, letting herself in with the key we'd given her years ago for emergencies. She came upstairs with a cold bottle of ginger ale and some saltine crackers, sitting on the edge of our bed and feeling my forehead with her cool hand, like she'd done when I was a child with a fever. "You're still warm," she murmured, her brow furrowed with worry. "Have you been taking your temperature?" "It was 101 this morning," I told her, my voice scratchy and weak. "But I think it's coming down." She stayed for about 30 minutes, making sure I drank some ginger ale and ate a few crackers. We talked about nothing important, just the kind of rambling conversation sick people have when they're too exhausted to focus, but grateful for the company. At one point, she stood up to adjust the blinds because the afternoon sun was hitting me directly, and as she did, I noticed something that made my fuzzy, fever-addled brain pause. She was wearing perfume. Not her usual light, barely there floral scent, but something heavier, muskier, almost sensual. It seemed odd for a woman in her late 80s to be wearing such a distinctive perfume, especially for a quick errand to bring her sick daughter ginger ale. "New perfume, Mom?" I asked, more making conversation than actually suspicious. She turned from the window, and for just a fraction of a second, something flickered across her face. Surprise? Guilt? It was gone so fast I couldn't be sure. "Oh, this! Yes, I saw it at the drugstore and thought I'd try something different. Do you like it?" "It's nice," I lied. Actually, it was making my already queasy stomach worse, but I wasn't about to tell her that. "Just different from your usual." "Well, even old ladies like to feel pretty sometimes," she said with a light laugh, smoothing her hand over her hair in a gesture that suddenly seemed almost flirtatious, though that word felt absurd to apply to my elderly mother. She left shortly after, and I dozed off, attributing my unsettled feeling to the flu and fever. But when I woke up later, the scent of that perfume still lingering faintly in our bedroom, I felt that same uncomfortable flutter I'd experienced at the cookout. Something about it didn't sit right, but I couldn't articulate what or why. The third incident happened that summer in July. Charles had taken my mother to her doctor's appointment because I had a work commitment I couldn't reschedule. This was fairly common. Charles often helped with my mother's appointments, grocery shopping, and other errands. He was thoughtful that way, treating her like his own mother, which I'd always appreciated. They were supposed to be gone for maybe 90 minutes. The appointment was at 2, usually took about 30 minutes, then maybe a stop at the pharmacy if she needed prescriptions refilled. I expected them back by 4 at the latest. When 5 o'clock rolled around and I still hadn't heard from either of them, I started to worry. My mother was 89 years old. What if something had happened at the doctor's office? What if there'd been bad news and Charles was trying to figure out how to tell me? I called his cell phone. It rang 6 times before going to voicemail. I called my mother's cell, which she rarely remembered to charge, and got the same result. By 5:30, I was genuinely anxious, pacing the kitchen and imagining worst-case scenarios. At 5:40, I heard Charles's truck pull into the driveway. I met them at the door, relief flooding through me. "Where have you been? I've been so worried. I tried calling both of you." Charles looked surprised. "Oh, sorry, honey. My phone was in the truck and I didn't hear it. We just went to dinner after the appointment. Your mom mentioned she was hungry, so we stopped at that Italian place on Lorraine she likes." My mother nodded, smiling. The appointment ran long and I realized I hadn't eaten lunch. Charles was sweet enough to take me to Mama Santa's. You know how I love their chicken parmesan. It was perfectly reasonable, completely innocent. But something about the way they both answered, the way their explanations aligned just a bit too smoothly, made that uncomfortable feeling bloom in my chest again. And there was something else. They both looked slightly flushed, energized in a way that seemed odd for an elderly woman who'd just been to a doctor's appointment and a man who'd spent 3.5 hours doing a favor for his mother-in-law. "How did the appointment go?" I asked my mother, pushing down the weird feeling. "Oh, fine, fine. You know Dr. Patterson. He says I'm healthy as a horse for my age. Adjusted one of my blood pressure medications, but that's it." Charles excused himself to wash up, and my mother and I sat at the kitchen table. She told me more details about the appointment, about the restaurant, about the traffic on the way home. Everything sounded normal, reasonable, exactly what you'd expect. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was missing something, that there was a conversation happening beneath the conversation I could hear. The 4th sign came in December of that same year, during a Christmas shopping trip. I'd invited my mother to go to the mall with me to shop for the grandkids. We'd made a day of it, browsing through stores, having lunch at the food court, enjoying that easy companionship that had defined our relationship my entire life. Around 3 in the afternoon, we were in a department store when my mother's phone rang. She glanced at the screen, and her face lit up in a way that made her look decades younger. "Oh, I need to take this, honey," she said, already walking toward the front of the store. "I'll be right back." I nodded and continued looking at a sweater display, thinking it might be one of my cousins calling. But after 5 minutes passed, then 10, I started to wonder. I wandered toward the front of the store and found my mother standing outside, phone pressed to her ear, laughing at something the person on the other end had said. Her whole demeanor was different, animated, almost girlish, her free hand gesturing as she talked. When she finally ended the call and came back inside, her cheeks were pink, and she had this pleased, secretive smile on her face. "Everything okay?" I asked. "Oh yes, just a friend," she said, waving her hand dismissively. She was telling me about something funny that happened at her bridge club, but I'd watched my mother talk to her friends 100 times, and this conversation hadn't looked like that. The body language was different, the energy was different. Still, I told myself I was being paranoid, reading too much into innocent moments. My mother was allowed to have friends I didn't know everything about. She was entitled to privacy and her own social life. The 5th incident was subtle, almost nothing, but it stuck with me. It was February 2013. and I'd stopped by my mother's apartment unannounced, something I rarely did because I always tried to respect her independence and privacy. I'd been in the neighborhood and had picked up some fresh flowers from the grocery store, thinking she'd enjoy them. When I knocked on her door, it took her longer than usual to answer. When she finally opened it, she seemed flustered, smoothing her hair and adjusting her blouse. "Barbara, what a lovely surprise." "I brought you flowers," I said, holding them up. "Is this a bad time?" No, of course not. Come in." She stepped aside, and as I entered, I noticed her apartment seemed warmer than usual, and there was a faint scent in the air that I couldn't quite place. Something masculine, like men's cologne or aftershave. "Were you expecting someone?" I asked, looking around. Everything appeared normal, nothing out of place. "No, why?" She took the flowers from me, moving towards the kitchen to find a vase. "I just thought I smelled. Never mind." I shook my head, feeling foolish. "It's nothing." We had a pleasant visit, maybe 30 minutes, during which my mother seemed slightly distracted, checking the clock on her wall more than usual. When I finally left, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd interrupted something, though I had no idea what. The sixth sign came in April of 2013. Charles had been spending more time at the shop than usual, often coming home after 7 instead of his usual 6:30. He explained that business was good and he'd taken on a couple of big restoration projects that required evening work. It made sense. The shop had indeed been busier, and I knew restoration work was time-consuming and couldn't always be done during regular business hours. One Tuesday evening, I decided to surprise him with dinner at the shop. I'd made his favorite pot roast, packed it up in containers that would keep it warm, and drove over around 6:30. When I pulled into the parking lot, I was surprised to see the shop was dark. No lights on, bay doors all closed, Charles's truck nowhere in sight. I sat there for a moment, confused. Where was he? I called his cell phone. He answered on the second ring, and I could hear noise in the background, like traffic or people talking. "Hey, honey," he said, sounding slightly out of breath. "What's up?" "I'm at the shop with dinner for you, but you're not here. Where are you?" There was a pause, just a beat too long, before he answered. "Oh, I had to run to the parts store. Needed something for the Mustang restoration I'm working on. I'll be back in about 20 minutes if you want to wait." "The parts store closes at 6, I said, glancing at the clock on my dashboard. It was 6:40. Another tiny pause. "Right, well, I caught them just as they were closing. Guy was nice enough to let me in. Listen, why don't you just head home and I'll eat when I get there? Probably be another 40 minutes with this errand and cleaning up at the shop." I agreed and drove home, but something about the conversation nagged at me. The background noise hadn't sounded like a parts store. It had sounded like a restaurant or maybe a store with more people, more ambient noise. And why would a parts store employee, who'd already stayed late as a favor, let Charles browse for 40 minutes after closing? When Charles got home that night at 8:15, the pot roast reheated and eaten mostly in silence, I watched him carefully. He seemed normal, tired from a long day, appreciative of the dinner, talking about the Mustang restoration and what still needed to be done. But there was something in his eyes when I asked about the parts he'd bought. Some flicker of... what? Guilt? Discomfort? It was gone too quickly for me to be sure. The 7th sign happened in June. I'd been having trouble sleeping, a problem that had started in my late 50s and only gotten worse as I approached 60. This particular night, I'd woken at 2 in the morning and couldn't fall back asleep. I went downstairs to make chamomile tea, thinking it might help. As I stood in the dark kitchen waiting for the kettle to boil, I heard Charles's phone buzz on the counter where he'd left it charging. I glanced at it automatically, not really thinking, and saw a text message preview on the locked screen. It was from a number not saved in his contacts. "Can't wait to see you tomorrow, same time?" My heart started pounding. Who would be texting my husband at 2 in the morning about seeing him tomorrow? I picked up the phone. thinking I'd unlock it and read the full message, but I didn't know his passcode. We'd never had passcodes on our phones before. This was something he'd started doing about 6 months ago, explaining that one of his employees had mentioned it was good for security. I stood there in the dark kitchen, Charles's phone in my hand, the kettle starting to whistle softly. Every instinct told me to wake him up and demand to know who was texting him at this hour. But another part of me, the part that had spent 40 years trusting this man completely, whispered that it was probably innocent. Maybe a friend with insomnia, maybe someone in a different time zone, maybe a customer confirming an early morning drop-off. I set the phone back down exactly where I'd found it and made my tea. I didn't sleep at all the rest of that night. The 8th and final sign came in September of 2014. My mother had fallen in her apartment. Nothing serious, but scary enough that she'd pressed her emergency button and been taken to the hospital for x-rays. I'd gotten the call at work and rushed to Metro Health, my heart in my throat, terrified that at 91, a fall could mean broken hips, or worse. Charles had been at the shop, but said he'd meet me there as soon as he could. When I arrived at the emergency room, I found my mother already in a bed in the ER, looking small and frail in a hospital gown, an IV in her arm. She brightened when she saw me. "Oh, honey, I'm so sorry to scare you. I'm fine, really. Just tripped over my own feet." I took her hand, relief flooding through me. "What did the doctor say?" "Nothing broken, just some bruising. They want to keep me a few hours for observation since I hit my head a little, but I should be able to go home tonight." We sat together, talking, her telling me exactly what had happened when Charles arrived. He came through the curtain with a worried expression, went immediately to my mother's bedside, and took her other hand. "Ruth, are you okay? God, you scared us." The way he said it, the genuine fear and concern in his voice, would have seemed touching, would have reinforced what I'd always believed, that Charles truly cared about my mother as family. But something about the way he held her hand, something about the look that passed between them before they both remembered I was there, sent ice water through my veins. It was a look of intimacy, not the kind shared between a son-in-law and mother-in-law, the kind shared between people who know each other's bodies, who've seen each other vulnerable in ways that have nothing to do with hospital beds and IVs. I saw it for maybe 3 seconds before they both looked away, before my mother smiled at me and Charles started asking practical questions about what the doctors had said. But those 3 seconds changed something fundamental in me. For the first time in all those years, all those little odd moments and unexplained inconsistencies, I allowed myself to actually consider the unthinkable. But even then, even with all 8 of these moments stacked up in my memory, I still couldn't make myself believe it. It was too monstrous, too impossible. So I did what I'd done every other time. I pushed it down, explained it away, told myself I was being crazy and paranoid and ungrateful for the life I had. It would be another 3 years before I could no longer ignore the truth. By the spring of 2017, I was 63 years old and approaching what I'd assumed would be the peaceful golden years Charles and I had worked so hard to build. The kids were well established in their own lives. The grandchildren were growing like weeds, and Charles was talking about maybe scaling back his hours at the shop within the next year or 2. We'd started having conversations about what retirement might look like. Maybe a small RV to travel around the country, maybe winters in Florida like so many other Cleveland retirees. Maybe just quiet days at home with our books and our garden. My mother had started to decline more noticeably. At 94, she was still remarkably sharp mentally, but physically she was weakening. She'd given up driving 2 years earlier, and I'd taken over most of her shopping and appointments. She'd fallen twice more since that September incident in 2014, and though she'd been lucky each time with no major injuries, I knew it was only a matter of time before her luck ran out. I spent more time with her than ever, usually stopping by her apartment 3 or 4 times a week. Charles continued to help out too, taking her to appointments when I couldn't, doing small repairs in her apartment, bringing her favorite Chinese takeout from the restaurant on West 25th Street. To any outside observer, we looked like a family doing exactly what families should do, taking care of an aging parent with love and devotion. The morning of October 17, 2017, started like any other Tuesday. I woke at 6:30, made coffee while Charles showered, and we had our usual breakfast of toast and fruit while reading different sections of The Plain Dealer. He left for the shop at 7:45, kissing the top of my head absently on his way out the door. I had the day off from my part-time job at the library, and my plan was to do some grocery shopping, maybe finally organize the junk drawer in the kitchen that had become impossible to open without things spilling out. Around 10 o'clock, my phone rang. It was Brenda Washington, the activities coordinator at my mother's senior apartment complex. My stomach immediately clenched the way it always did when someone from the complex called, anticipating news of another fall or medical emergency. "Mrs. Evans, hi, this is Brenda. Listen, please don't panic, but your mother isn't in her apartment this morning." My heart started pounding. "What do you mean she's not there?" "She didn't show up for the morning exercise class, which isn't like her, so I went to check on her. She's not answering her door, and I used my master key to look inside. The apartment is empty. Her bed wasn't slept in last night." Everything after that became a blur of panic and action. I called Charles immediately, my hands shaking so badly I could barely dial. He answered on the first ring. "Mom's missing," I told him without preamble. "She wasn't in her apartment last night. Nobody knows where she is." There was a sharp intake of breath. "What? Where could she have gone?" "I don't know. I'm about to call the police. Can you come home?" "I'm leaving right now," he said immediately. I could hear him moving, keys jangling. "Call me if you hear anything." The next 3 hours were a nightmare of phone calls and worst-case scenarios playing through my head. I called all of her friends, her doctor's office, even the local hospitals, terrified I'd find out she'd been brought in unconscious or worse. I filed a missing persons report with the police, though the officer I spoke to seemed less concerned than I felt, explaining that adults have the right to go wherever they want, and 94-year-olds sometimes do unexpected things. Charles came home and immediately started making his own calls, checking with people at his shop in case she'd somehow made her way there, calling our kids in case she'd contacted them. We were both frantic, united in our fear and confusion. Where would a 94-year-old woman go in the middle of the night? How would she have gotten there? She didn't drive, couldn't walk more than a block or two without getting winded, and had no history of confusion or dementia that might explain wandering off. At 1:15, my phone rang again. It was Brenda. "Mrs. Evans, your mother just came back. She's fine. She's in her apartment. I think you might want to come over." I don't remember the drive to the Madison Towers Senior Living Facility. Charles followed in his truck, and we both practically ran from the parking lot to the elevator, our hearts racing with relief and residual fear and a growing confusion about what could possibly have happened. Brenda met us on the 4th floor, outside my mother's apartment. Her expression was carefully neutral in that way, professional caregivers perfect when they're trying not to show judgment. "She's fine physically," Brenda said quietly. "She said she was with a friend and lost track of time. She seems more embarrassed than anything." "A friend?" I repeated. "What friend? Where?" "She wouldn't give me details, said it was private." Brenda hesitated, then added in an even quieter voice, "Mrs. Evans, I should mention that when she came in, she was wearing different clothes than when she left yesterday, and she was carrying an overnight bag." The implication hung in the air between us, absurd and impossible. My 94-year-old mother had spent the night with someone and was trying to keep it private. Under any other circumstances, I might have laughed at the ridiculousness of it, might have felt happy that she'd found companionship in her final years. But something deep in my gut something connected to all those little moments over the past 6 years, was screaming that this wasn't a sweet story about an elderly woman finding late-life romance. I knocked on her door, Charles standing beside me. My mother opened it after a moment, looking tired but composed. She was indeed wearing different clothes than I'd last seen her in, a soft blue sweater and dark slacks that I didn't recognize. "Hi, honey," she said, attempting a smile. "I'm sorry I worried you." "Mom, where were you?" I asked, trying to keep my voice calm. "You scared us half to death." "I was with a friend," she said, stepping back to let us in. "I should have called, I know. I just didn't think anyone would notice." "The whole complex noticed," I said, hearing my voice rise despite my efforts to stay calm. "We filed a missing persons report, Mom. We thought something terrible had happened." "I'm sorry," she said again, and she did look genuinely regretful. "I didn't mean to cause such a fuss. I'm fine. Really. I was perfectly safe." "Who were you with?" Charles asked, his voice gentle but firm. "We need to know who you're spending time with, Ruth. What if something had happened to you?" My mother looked at him for a long moment, and in that look, I saw something that made my blood run cold. It was the same look I'd seen in the hospital 3 years ago. That flash of intimacy I'd convinced myself I'd imagined. "It's private," she said quietly. "I'm entitled to some privacy, aren't I? I'm 94 years old, Barbara, not a child." We went back and forth for another 20 minutes, me insisting I needed to know she was safe, her insisting she was entitled to her own life. Charles stayed mostly quiet, which was unlike him, interjecting only occasionally to try to mediate between us. Finally, exhausted and frustrated, I told her we'd talk about it more later and left, Charles following. In the hallway, waiting for the elevator, I turned to him. "Something's not right about this." "What do you mean?" he asked, but his eyes didn't quite meet mine. "I mean, where would she go? Who would she be with? She barely leaves the building except when I take her places." "Maybe she's seeing someone," Charles offered. "Maybe she's got a boyfriend and is embarrassed to tell you." The word boyfriend sounded absurd in reference to my 94-year-old mother, but I supposed it was possible. The complex did have male residents, but something about the whole situation felt wrong, felt staged somehow, though I couldn't articulate why. Over the next week, I tried several times to get my mother to tell me where she'd been that night. She remained frustratingly vague. A friend, somewhere safe, none of my business. Her stubbornness was infuriating and unlike her. We'd always been close, always shared things. This secretiveness was new and unsettling. I started paying closer attention to her schedule, to Charles's schedule, to the little gaps and inconsistencies I'd been ignoring for years. And once I started really looking, really paying attention without the filter of trust and assumption, things began to click into place with horrible clarity. Charles's late nights at the shop had increased over the past few years, but when I actually thought about it, they never seemed to result in more income. The business was doing fine, but not better than usual. What was taking up all that extra time? My mother had started being vague about her schedule, too, mentioning appointments and bridge games and activities that never seemed to have concrete details. When had that started? How long had I been accepting "I'm busy Thursday" without asking busy with what? And those little moments, those 8 signs I'd noticed and dismissed over the years, suddenly didn't feel isolated anymore. They felt like a pattern, like a story I'd been refusing to read, even though it was written right in front of me. On October 24th, exactly 1 week after my mother's mysterious overnight disappearance, I decided to do something I'd never done before in 43 years of marriage. I decided to follow Charles. He left for work at his usual time, 7:45, kissing my head as always. I waited 5 minutes, then got in my car and drove toward his shop. But instead of pulling into his parking lot, I parked down the street where I could see the entrance. I felt ridiculous, like a character in a bad television drama, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I needed to know the truth, whatever it was. Charles's truck was in the parking lot. I sat there for 2 hours listening to NPR and feeling increasingly foolish. Maybe I was losing my mind. Maybe stress and menopause and fear about aging were making me paranoid. At 10:30, I was about to give up and go home when Charles emerged from the shop, got in his truck, and drove away. I followed him, staying far enough back that he wouldn't notice me. My hands were shaking on the steering wheel. I didn't even know what I was looking for or what I expected to find. Maybe he was just going to the bank or to pick up parts or to meet a customer. Maybe this was all completely innocent, and I was about to feel like the world's most distrustful, paranoid wife. He didn't go to the bank. He didn't go to a parts store. He drove to Madison Towers, my mother's apartment complex, and pulled into a visitor parking spot. I sat in my car across the street, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. There could be a million innocent reasons for Charles to visit my mother in the middle of a Tuesday morning. Maybe he was checking on her after last week's scare. Maybe she'd called him to fix something in her apartment. Maybe he was bringing her groceries because I'd mentioned she was running low on coffee. I watched him get out of his truck, carrying a small bag that looked like it might be from a coffee shop. He walked into the building with the confidence of someone who knew exactly where he was going, someone who'd made this trip many times before. I sat there for 15 minutes, 20, 30, my mind spinning with explanations and excuses and rationalizations. Then I got out of my car and walked into the building. The elevator ride to the 4th floor felt like it took hours. My legs were shaking so badly I had to lean against the wall. I kept telling myself I was wrong, I was crazy. There was no way what I was thinking could possibly be true. Charles loved me. My mother loved me. This was all just a terrible misunderstanding. I walked down the hallway to my mother's apartment, my footsteps silent on the carpeted floor. I stood outside her door for a long moment, my hand raised to knock, my heart hammering in my chest. And then I heard it. Laughter. My husband's laugh. That deep, genuine sound I'd heard 1,000 times over 4 decades. And my mother's laugh. Lighter, almost girlish, younger than I'd heard her sound in years. My hand dropped to my side. I stood there, frozen, listening to them laugh together inside that apartment, and something inside me cracked, not broke, not yet, but cracked like ice just beginning to fracture. I pulled out my phone with shaking hands and checked the Find My app. Yes, Charles's phone was right here, in this building, in this apartment. I'd set up the family sharing feature years ago, mostly so we could find each other's phones when we misplaced them around the house. I'd never used it like this, never tracked his location without him knowing. I stood there for what felt like hours but was probably only 5 minutes, listening to my husband and my mother's muffled voices through the door, unable to make out words but hearing the tone, comfortable, intimate, familiar in a way that had nothing to do with family dinners and birthday parties. Then I did knock. 3 firm raps on the door. The voices inside went silent immediately, completely silent, the kind of silence that speaks louder than words. After a long moment, I heard footsteps approaching, and the door opened to reveal my mother, her face flushed, her hair slightly mussed. "Barbara," she said, and I heard surprise and something else in her voice. Fear, maybe, or guilt. "What are you doing here?" I looked past her into the apartment. Charles was standing near the kitchen, that coffee shop bag on the counter, his face pale, his expression caught between too many emotions to name. "I could ask you the same thing," I said, looking at Charles. "You didn't mention you were coming here when you left for work this morning." "I had to drop something off for your mom," he said, but his voice sounded hollow, rehearsed, like the explanation he'd given about coming home early from the shop all those years ago. "What did you have to drop off?" I asked, my voice surprisingly steady, despite the fact that my entire world was tilting sideways. Neither of them answered right away. The silence stretched between the three of us, thick with unspoken truths and decades of lies. And in that silence, I knew. I finally let myself know what some part of me had been trying to tell me for 6 years. The overnight bag, the mysterious disappearance, the late nights and vague excuses, the perfume and the looks and the comfort that seemed too intimate to be what I'd always assumed it was. "How long?" I heard myself ask, my voice sounding like it was coming from very far away. "Barbara, honey," my mother started, but I cut her off. "How long?" Charles and my mother looked at each other, another one of those intimate glances that told me everything I needed to know. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. 13 years. The world didn't end in that moment. The ceiling didn't fall in. The floor didn't open up to swallow me. I just stood there in my mother's apartment doorway, looking at the two people I'd loved and trusted more than anyone else in the world, and felt absolutely nothing. No rage, no tears, no screaming. Just that hollow, hysterical laughter bubbling up from somewhere deep in my chest, because the alternative was to completely lose my sanity right there in that hallway. I laughed until I couldn't breathe, until Charles and my mother were both staring at me with horrified expressions, until one of my mother's neighbors opened their door to see what the commotion was about. Then I turned around and walked away. The drive home was completely blank in my memory. One moment I was walking out of Madison Towers, and the next I was sitting in my car, in my own driveway, having no recollection of the route I'd taken, or how long it had taken me to get there. My hands were still gripping the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles had gone white, and I had to consciously force my fingers to relax and release before I could get out of the car. Inside the house, everything looked exactly as I'd left it that morning. My coffee cup still sat on the kitchen counter, half full and probably cold by now. The newspaper was still spread out on the table, Charles's reading glasses folded on top of the sports section. The junk drawer I'd planned to organize still hung slightly open, a tangled phone charger preventing it from closing completely. Everything was exactly the same as it had been 3 hours ago, which felt impossible because in those 3 hours my entire reality had shattered. I went to the living room and sat down on the couch, still feeling that strange numbness, that sense of watching myself from outside my body. The rational part of my brain was trying to process the information. Charles and my mother, 13 years, an affair that had been happening right in front of me while I planned family dinners and celebrated holidays and trusted them both completely. 13 years ago, I'd been 50 years old. Charles would have been 52, my mother 81. Our youngest, Sarah, had just graduated from college. We'd taken a family trip to Niagara Falls that summer to celebrate. I remembered that trip clearly. All 3 kids and their significant others, my mother joining us despite her complaints about her arthritis acting up in the humidity. We'd stayed in a hotel with connecting rooms, taken the Maid of the Mist tour, eaten at a Brazilian steakhouse where we'd laughed until our sides hurt. Had they been sleeping together already by then? Had they snuck away during that trip, maybe claiming they were going for a walk while I stayed back with the kids? The thought made my stomach turn. I tried to identify what I was feeling, but it was like trying to see through thick fog. There was anger somewhere under the numbness. I could sense it like a distant storm on the horizon. There was grief, too, the kind of deep, aching grief you feel when someone dies, because in a way, someone had. The Charles I'd known, the mother I'd known, they were dead now, revealed to be fiction all along. The real Charles, the real Ruth, were people I didn't know at all, but stronger than anger or grief was betrayal. Not just by Charles, which would have been devastating enough, but by my mother, the woman who'd given birth to me, who'd raised me, who'd been my best friend and my anchor my entire life. She'd looked me in the eye at countless family dinners, had held my hand through hard times, had given me advice about my marriage, all while sleeping with my husband. The The phone rang, making me jump. Charles's name lit up the screen. I stared at it for a long moment, then let it go to voicemail. It rang again immediately. Voicemail again. Then a text. "Please, we need to talk. I'm so sorry." I turned off my phone and went upstairs to our bedroom. The bed was neatly made, the way I'd left it that morning. Charles's pajamas were folded on his pillow. His cologne sat on the dresser next to a framed photo from our 25th anniversary cruise. We looked so happy in that photo, standing on the ship's deck with the ocean behind us, Charles's arm around my waist, both of us smiling at the camera. That had been 18 years ago, so they hadn't been together yet when that photo was taken, but they would be soon. Maybe they were already feeling that first dangerous attraction, those moments of eye contact that lasted too long, those casual touches that felt less casual than they should. I thought about that cruise, trying to remember if there had been signs even then. My mother hadn't come on that trip, so there were no opportunities for them to be together. But had Charles seemed distant? Had he mentioned my mother more than usual? I couldn't remember. The memories felt contaminated now, unreliable, like looking at photographs and wondering which ones were staged. I lay down on the bed, still fully clothed, and stared at the ceiling. The ceiling fan spun lazily overhead, making the same soft clicking sound it had made for the past 15 years. We'd been meaning to replace it, but never got around to it. That seemed absurd now, worrying about ceiling fans and junk drawers when my entire marriage had been a lie for 13 years. How had I not known? That was the question that kept circling in my mind. How had I lived with Charles every single day, slept in the same bed, shared meals and conversations, and a life, and not known that he was sleeping with my mother? How had I sat across from my mother countless times, looked into her eyes, held her hand, and not seen the truth? But I knew the answer, even if I didn't want to admit it. I hadn't known because I trusted them completely. Trust is like wearing blinders. You only see what you're looking for, and I'd been looking for a loving husband and a devoted mother, so that's what I'd seen. Every warning sign, every moment of cognitive dissonance, I'd explained away because the alternative was unthinkable. The unthinkable had been true all along. I must have fallen asleep at some point, because when I opened my eyes again, the room was darker, and my phone, which I'd turned back on without remembering doing so, showed it was after 6. There were 14 missed calls, 8 from Charles, 6 from my mother. There were countless text messages I couldn't bring myself to read. I got up and went to the bathroom, splashed cold water on my face, and looked at myself in the mirror. I looked exactly the same as I had that morning, a 63-year-old woman with short graying hair, lines around her eyes and mouth, nothing remarkable or special. I'd always thought I looked okay for my age, had taken reasonable care of myself without being vain about it, but clearly I hadn't been enough. 13 years. That meant Charles had been sleeping with both of us for 13 years. Had he compared us? Did he prefer her? The thought made my skin crawl, imagining Charles and my mother in bed together, doing things I didn't even want to picture. My mother would have been in her 80s when it started. How was that even physically possible? But I supposed where there was a will, there was a way, and apparently they'd had plenty of will. I heard Charles's truck pull into the driveway. My stomach clenched, and for a moment I considered locking myself in the bedroom, refusing to face him. But that felt cowardly, and if there was one thing I still had, after everything that had been taken from me today, it was my dignity. I went downstairs and sat at the kitchen table, my hands folded in front of me, waiting. I heard his key in the lock, the front door opening and closing, his footsteps approaching slowly, cautiously. He appeared in the kitchen doorway looking haggard, his face pale, his eyes red-rimmed like he'd been crying. Good, I thought, with a viciousness that surprised me. I hoped he'd been crying. I hoped he'd been suffering even a fraction of what I was suffering. "Barbara," he said, his voice hoarse. Please, can we talk? You're going to talk, I said, my voice cold and controlled. I'm going to listen, and then I'm going to decide what happens next. He pulled out a chair and sat down across from me, his hands shaking as he placed them flat on the table. I don't know where to start. Start with when, I said. When did it start? And I want the truth, Charles. No more lies. You owe me that much. He took a shaky breath. It was February of 2004. Your mother had called me, said she had a leak under her kitchen sink. You were at work, and I went over to fix it. February 2004. 13 years and 8 months ago. I'd been 49 years old, approaching 50, and feeling sensitive about aging, about becoming invisible the way women do in this country when they're no longer young. Charles had thrown me a surprise 50th birthday party that June, had told me I was more beautiful than the day we married. He'd been fucking my mother for 4 months by then. How did it happen? I asked, my voice still eerily calm. I fixed the leak, he said quietly, not meeting my eyes. We had coffee afterward. We were talking and she was telling me how lonely she was. How hard it was being alone after your dad died. And I don't know, Barbara. I don't know how to explain it. One moment we were talking, and the next moment we were kissing. And then, I prompted when he fell silent, and then we went to her bedroom. His voice was barely audible. Afterward, we both felt terrible. We agreed it could never happen again, that it was a mistake, that we'd take it to our graves. But it did happen again, I stated flatly. About a month later, I went over to help her with something else, and it just happened again. And then it kept happening. We tried to stop, Barbara, I swear we tried, but we couldn't. I laughed, a harsh sound with no humor in it. You couldn't stop. For 13 years you couldn't stop. You couldn't stop while I was making you dinner every night. You couldn't stop while we were celebrating anniversaries and taking family vacations. You couldn't stop while I was taking care of her when she was sick, while I was shopping for her, while I was doing everything a good daughter should do. I know, he whispered. I know how horrible it is. There's no excuse, Barbara. There's nothing I can say that makes this okay. You're right, I agreed. There isn't. Tell me about the logistics. How did you manage it? When did you see each other? He looked up at me, and I could see in his eyes that he was surprised by how clinical I was being, how controlled. He'd probably expected screaming and throwing things. Part of me wanted to. Part of me wanted to break every dish in this house over his cheating head. But a bigger part of me needed to understand. Needed to know exactly what had been done to me. Sometimes during the day, he admitted, when you were at work, I'd leave the shop and go to her apartment. We'd have an hour, maybe 2. The late nights at the shop? I asked. Sometimes. Not always. Sometimes I really was working late. But sometimes I'd tell you I was working and go to her place instead. The night I brought you dinner and you weren't there, where were you? His face flushed with shame. I was with her, at a hotel in Strongsville. She'd wanted to go somewhere different, somewhere we wouldn't risk being seen. A hotel. They'd gone to hotels. They'd planned romantic getaways, while I sat at home thinking my husband was working to build our future. The night she disappeared last week? I asked, though I already knew the answer. She was with me, he confirmed. At the same hotel. We'd planned it for her birthday, wanted to spend a whole night together for once. We didn't think anyone would notice. Didn't realize the complex tracked attendance at activities. Oh, they planned it for her birthday, I said, my voice dripping with venom. How thoughtful. Tell me, Charles, when you were inside her, did you think about me? Did you think about the fact that she gave birth to me, that I came from her body? Did that make it more exciting for you? He flinched like I'd slapped him. Barbara, please. Did you love her? I interrupted. Do you love her? The silence that followed that question was answer enough. He looked down at his hands, and I saw tears fall onto the table. Yes, he finally whispered. I love you both. I know that sounds impossible, but it's true. I never stopped loving you, Barbara. But yes, I love her too. Something shifted in me then. The numbness began to crack, and underneath it was a rage so pure and hot it felt like it might consume me from the inside out. Get out, I said quietly. He looked up, shocked. What? Get out of this house, I repeated, my voice rising. Right now. Go pack a bag and get out. Go to her, since you love her so much. Go live with your 94-year-old girlfriend in her senior apartment. See how you like that. Barbara, can't we... Get out! I screamed, all that control finally shattering. Get out of my house! Get out of my sight! I can't bear to look at you for one more second! He stood up slowly, looking like he wanted to say something, to reach for me. I grabbed the nearest thing, which happened to be the vase of artificial flowers I kept on the table, and threw it at him. It missed and shattered against the wall behind him, plastic flowers scattering across the kitchen floor. Out! I said again, my voice shaking. Now! He went upstairs, and I heard him moving around our bedroom, opening drawers, his footsteps heavy on the floor above my head. 15 minutes later, he came back down, carrying a duffel bag, the same one he used for his fishing trips with our son-in-law. He paused at the kitchen doorway. I'm so sorry, Barbara. I never meant to hurt you. But you did, I said flatly. For 13 years you hurt me. You just made sure I didn't know about it. That doesn't make it better, Charles. It makes it worse. Now get out before I call the police and have you removed. He left. I heard his truck start in the driveway, heard him drive away. The house fell into complete silence. And then, finally, I let myself fall apart. I slid off the kitchen chair onto the floor and sobbed until I thought I might be sick. Great heaving wails of grief and rage and betrayal that came from somewhere so deep inside me, I didn't know that place existed. I cried for the 43 years of marriage that had been a lie. I cried for the relationship with my mother that was now irreparably destroyed. I cried for the grandmother my kids had adored, who turned out to be someone none of us actually knew. I cried for the naive woman I'd been that morning, who'd been worried about junk drawers and never imagined her world was about to implode. I don't know how long I sat on that kitchen floor. Eventually, the tears stopped because there was simply no more left. I was empty, hollowed out, a shell of the person I'd been 12 hours ago. The house phone rang. I ignored it. My cell phone buzzed with text after text. I ignored those too. At some point I realized I should probably eat something, but the thought of food made my stomach turn. I managed to drink some water, then went back upstairs and crawled into bed fully clothed for the second time that day. Sleep came eventually, fitful and full of nightmares where Charles and my mother were laughing at me, where I was invisible while they carried on right in front of me, where I was screaming but no sound came out. When I woke up the next morning, there was a split second where I didn't remember, where the world was still normal and whole. Then it all came crashing back, and the grief started fresh. If you've ever lived here, you know what this is like. That moment when you wake up from something traumatic and realize it wasn't a bad dream, it actually happened. It's like experiencing the loss all over again. I had no idea how I was going to survive this. No idea how I was going to face the world, face my children, face the rest of my life with this knowledge. The thought of telling the kids made me want to die. The thought of anyone finding out, of being pitied and gossiped about was unbearable. But lying in that bed, staring at the ceiling while morning light filtered through the curtains, I made myself a promise. I had been a victim of their betrayal, but I was not going to remain a victim. I was not going to let this destroy me. I was going to find a way through this. And when I came out on the other side, I was going to be stronger than either of them could imagine. I just had no idea yet how I was going to get there. The next few days passed in a fog of grief and shock that I can barely remember now. I called in sick to my part-time library job, unable to imagine facing co-workers and their cheerful small talk when my entire world had just collapsed. I ignored probably 50 calls from Charles and at least 30 from my mother. The text messages came in waves: apologies, explanations, pleas to talk, promises that they never meant to hurt me. Each message felt like a fresh wound. They never meant to hurt me. They'd been betraying me for 13 years. Hurt was literally all they'd done. On the third day, my daughter Jennifer showed up at the house unannounced. I heard her key in the lock, her voice calling out, "Mom, Dad said you weren't feeling well. I brought you some soup." I was sitting at the kitchen table in the same clothes I'd been wearing for 2 days, surrounded by empty coffee cups and tear-soaked tissues. I hadn't showered, hadn't brushed my hair, probably looked like someone who'd been through a natural disaster, which, in a way, I had. Jennifer froze in the doorway when she saw me, the container of soup nearly slipping from her hands. "Mom, oh my God, what's wrong? Are you sick? Should I take you to the hospital?" And just like that, I had to decide. Did I tell her the truth right now, or did I lie and say I had the flu? Did I burden my daughter with this nightmare, or did I protect her from it as long as I could? The decision was made for me when Charles's name lit up my phone on the table between us. Jennifer glanced at it, then at me, and I watched understanding start to dawn in her eyes. She'd been married for 12 years. She knew what marital trouble looked like. "What did Dad do?" she asked quietly, setting the soup down and pulling out a chair. I opened my mouth to answer, then closed it again. "How did you tell your daughter that her father had been having an affair with her grandmother? Where did you even start with something that unthinkable?" "Mom, whatever it is, you can tell me," Jennifer said, reaching across the table to take my hand. "Is Dad having an affair?" I laughed, that same hollow, slightly hysterical sound that had become familiar over the past few days. "Yes," I managed to say. "Your father is having an affair. Has been for 13 years. Jennifer's face went pale. 13 years? Oh, Mom, I'm so sorry. Who is she? Do we know her?" "You know her," I said, my voice flat. "It's your grandmother." I watched the words process across my daughter's face. Confusion, disbelief, horror, and finally understanding. Her hand flew to her mouth. "No," she whispered. "No, that's not possible. Grandma Ruth? Your mother?" "For 13 years," I repeated, "while we had family dinners, while we celebrated birthdays and holidays, while I took care of her and loved her and trusted her." Jennifer's eyes filled with tears. "Mom, I can't. How did you find out?" I told her everything. The mysterious overnight disappearance, following Charles, the confrontation in my mother's apartment, the 13 years they'd admitted to. With each detail, I watched my daughter's face crumble a little more. "I think I'm going to be sick," she finally said, pushing her chair back and rushing to the bathroom. I heard her retching, then running water, then silence. When she came back 10 minutes later, her face was blotchy and her eyes were red. "I'm so sorry, Mom," she said, pulling me into a hug that I desperately needed. "I'm so sorry. What can I do? How can I help?" "I don't know," I admitted. "I don't even know what I'm going to do yet. Charles is staying at your grandmother's apartment. He took some clothes when I kicked him out, but most of his stuff is still here. I haven't called a lawyer yet. I haven't really done anything except exist." "You need to tell Michael and Sarah," Jennifer said gently. "They need to know. And yes, you need to call a lawyer. Like today. After 43 years of marriage, there's a lot to figure out legally." She stayed with me the rest of that day, and I was grateful for her presence, even though the grief seemed to fill every room of the house. She called her brothers, told them they needed to come to Cleveland, that it was urgent, but Mom was physically fine. They both agreed to come the next day, Saturday, though I could hear the worry in their voices when Jennifer handed me the phone to confirm I really was okay. I wasn't okay. I was so far from okay that I couldn't even see okay from where I was. But I was alive, and apparently that was going to have to be enough for now. Jennifer helped me shower and put on clean clothes, made me eat actual food for the first time in 3 days, and sat with me while I finally started to go through all those text messages. Most of them said variations of the same thing. I'm sorry. Please forgive me. Let me explain. It wasn't supposed to happen. I never wanted to hurt you. One message from my mother stood out. Barbara, I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I need you to understand that I love you. I have always loved you. What happened between Charles and me doesn't change that I'm your mother, and I would do anything for you. I stared at that message for a long time. The audacity of it, the sheer gall to claim she'd do anything for me while having spent 13 years sleeping with my husband, was almost impressive in its delusion. Anything for me except keep your hands off my husband, I muttered, showing Jennifer the message. She read it and her face hardened in a way I'd never seen before. My gentle, diplomatic daughter looked absolutely furious. I don't know if I can ever forgive her for this, Mom. I don't know if I can even look at her. Join the club, I said. Michael and Sarah both arrived the next day, Michael driving in from Lakewood with his wife Diane, Sarah flying in from Pittsburgh and taking an Uber from the airport. When I told them, gathered in my living room where we'd celebrated countless Christmases and birthdays, their reactions were similar to Jennifer's: disbelief, horror, anger, and finally a grief for the family we'd all thought we had. Sarah cried so hard she made herself sick. Michael punched a hole in my living room wall, immediately apologized, then sat on the floor with his head in his hands. Diane, who'd always been close with my mother, looked like someone had kicked her in the stomach. What kind of person does this? Sarah kept asking. What kind of mother betrays her own daughter like this? None of us had an answer. What are you going to do, Mom? Michael finally asked. Are you getting divorced? The D word hung in the air between us. After 43 years of marriage, after building a life together, after 3 children and a mortgage and a business and countless memories, good and bad, was I really going to end it? I don't know yet, I admitted. I can't even think that far ahead. Right now, I'm just trying to get through each day. But even as I said it, I knew that wasn't true, because somewhere underneath the grief and shock, a plan was starting to form. A plan that had nothing to do with forgiveness or reconciliation, and everything to do with making sure that Charles and my mother faced real consequences for what they'd done. I wasn't sure yet what that plan was going to look like, but I knew one thing with absolute certainty. I was done being the naive, trusting wife who explained away every warning sign. I was done being the good daughter who put her mother's comfort above her own needs. They'd spent 13 years lying to me, manipulating me, making a fool of me while they carried on their twisted affair. It was time for them to understand that actions have consequences, and I was going to make absolutely certain that the consequences were severe. If this story is resonating with you so far, I'd really appreciate if you could hit that like button and let me know in the comments what you think of what's happened. And if you're watching from another country, I'd love to hear where you're tuning in from. Your engagement helps this channel reach more women who might need to hear stories like this, and I'm grateful for every single one of you taking the time to be here with me today. Jennifer stayed with me that entire first week, sleeping in her old bedroom, making sure I ate, fielding calls from Charles and my mother that I still wasn't ready to take. Michael came over every evening after work, bringing groceries or dinner, sitting with me in companionable silence when I didn't want to talk. Sarah extended her visit, calling in sick to the hospital where she worked, saying her mother needed her and work would have to wait. Having my children rally around me like that should have been comforting, and in some ways it was. But it also made the betrayal cut even deeper. My mother had known these children since the moment they were born. She'd been at every birthday party, every school play, every milestone. She'd taught Sarah how to bake her famous chocolate chip cookies. She'd gone to Michael's football games, even in the cold and rain. She'd helped Jennifer plan her wedding, had cried tears of joy when she'd walked down the aisle. And through all of that, she'd been sleeping with their father. She'd sat at our family table on Thanksgiving and Christmas, had smiled at all of us while harboring this massive secret that would destroy us all if it came to light. What kind of person does that? What kind of grandmother looks her grandchildren in the eye while actively betraying their mother? By the end of that first week, the shock had started to wear off enough that I could think more clearly. The grief was still there, probably would always be there in some form, but it was being joined by something else. A cold, calculating anger that felt different from the hot rage I'd experienced that first day. This anger was patient. This anger was strategic. This anger wanted justice, not just emotional catharsis. I made my first phone call to a divorce attorney on Monday, exactly 1 week after the discovery. Her name was Patricia Morrison, and she came highly recommended by a friend who'd gone through a contentious divorce 5 years earlier. Patricia's office was in downtown Cleveland, in one of those modern high-rises that made me feel small and out of place. She was a woman in her mid-50s, professionally dressed with kind eyes that had seen enough pain to recognize it immediately in others. I told her everything, watching her expression shift from professional neutrality to genuine shock when I got to the part about my mother. "Mrs. Evans," she said carefully when I'd finished, "I've been practicing family law for 26 years, and I have to tell you, I've never heard of a situation quite like this. The affair with your mother adds a level of complexity that's unusual. Can I use it in the divorce?" I asked bluntly. "Can I make sure he gets less because of who he cheated with?" Patricia shook her head. Ohio is a no-fault divorce state, which means the reason for the divorce doesn't impact the division of assets. But what it does mean is that you have significant leverage in negotiations. If Charles wants to keep this quiet, if he wants to avoid this becoming public record in a contested divorce, he'll be motivated to settle on terms favorable to you. "I want the house," I said. "Free and clear. I want my share of his business, and I want enough from our retirement accounts to live comfortably. I don't care if he's left with almost nothing. He can go live with my mother in her government-subsidized senior apartment and see how he likes that." Patricia took notes, asked questions about our assets, the business, our bank accounts, retirement funds, the value of our home. The whole process felt surreal, reducing 43 years of marriage to a list of items to be divided up like we were splitting up after a garage sale. "I'll prepare a filing and a proposed settlement agreement," Patricia said. "Given the circumstances, I'd recommend we go in strong. We'll ask for everything you want, and then some. Anticipate he'll negotiate down and hopefully land where you need to be." "How long does this take?" I asked. "If he agrees to settle, it can be relatively quick. A few months, maybe. If he contests it, if we have to go to trial, it could be a year or more." I left her office feeling both empowered and exhausted. On one hand, I'd taken a concrete step toward ending this marriage and moving on with my life. On the other hand, the reality of divorce after 43 years was daunting in ways I hadn't fully processed yet. Charles and I had built everything together. Our entire adult lives had been intertwined. Untangling that was going to be painful and complicated. But the alternative was staying married to a man who'd betrayed me in the worst possible way. And that simply wasn't an option. My next move was harder, figuring out what to do about my mother. I still hadn't spoken to her directly. She'd stopped calling after the first few days, though the text messages continued, growing increasingly desperate. "Please, Barbara, let me explain. I'm sorry, I'm so sorry. You're my daughter and I love you. Please don't shut me out forever." Each message made me angrier. She was 94 years old, living alone in a senior apartment. Without me, she had no one to take her to doctor's appointments, no one to do her shopping, no one to check on her and make sure she was okay. My sister Linda barely called from Arizona, maybe once a month if that. My mother's friends at the complex were acquaintances, not people she could rely on for real help. She needed me, and she destroyed our relationship anyway. One evening, about 10 days after the discovery, I was sitting with Jennifer when she asked the question I'd been avoiding. "What are you going to do about Grandma, Mom?" "I don't know," I admitted. "Part of me wants to cut her out of my life completely, never see her or speak to her again." "You're allowed to do that," Jennifer said gently. "After what she did, no one would blame you." "But she's 94, I continued, "and she's my mother. And despite everything, some part of me still—" I trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. "Still loves her, still feels responsible for her, still can't quite wrap my mind around cutting my own mother out of my life forever." All of those things were true, and I hated myself a little for it. "You don't have to decide right now," Jennifer pointed out. "You're still processing. Give yourself time." But time wasn't going to change the fundamental facts. My mother had slept with my husband for 13 years. She'd looked me in the eye countless times while harboring that secret. She'd accepted my care, my love, my devotion, all while actively betraying me. There was no amount of time that was going to make that okay. What I needed wasn't time. What I needed was a way to make her understand the magnitude of what she'd done. Not just to me, but to her grandchildren, to the entire family she'd helped build and then burned to the ground. And slowly, over the next few weeks, a plan began to take shape. While Patricia Morrison worked on the divorce filing, I threw myself into planning something I'd never thought I'd have to plan. Revenge. Not the petty kind, like slashing tires or posting angry messages on social media. I wanted something more meaningful, something that would have lasting consequences and make both Charles and my mother truly understand what they'd destroyed. The business became my first target. Charles's auto repair shop had been moderately successful over the years, but I'd contributed to it in ways that weren't immediately obvious. I'd managed the bookkeeping for the first 10 years before he could afford to hire someone. I'd helped with marketing, had designed his first website back when businesses were just starting to establish an online presence, had networked with other business owners in Cleveland to drum up referrals. More importantly, when Charles had needed to expand the shop 5 years ago, we'd taken out a second mortgage on our house to finance it. That meant I had a claim to the business that went beyond just being his wife. Patricia and I went through everything with a fine-toothed comb. Charles had 2 employees, Jake and Marcus, both good guys who'd been with him for years. The shop turned a decent profit, enough to keep us comfortable, though not wealthy. Charles owned the building the shop was in, which was valuable Cleveland real estate that had appreciated significantly since he'd bought it in 1995. "You could force a sale of the business as part of the divorce settlement," Patricia explained. "You're entitled to half of everything, including the business. If Charles can't buy you out, the court could order the business sold and the proceeds split." The thought of destroying the business Charles had worked so hard to build gave me a grim satisfaction. But it also meant putting Jake and Marcus out of work, and they'd done nothing wrong. I didn't want collateral damage. I wanted surgical strikes that hit only the people who deserved it. What if instead of forcing a sale, I demanded a larger settlement in exchange for letting him keep the business? I asked. Patricia nodded approvingly. That's certainly an option. We could argue that your contribution to the business in its early years, plus the use of marital funds for the expansion, entitles you to a larger share of other assets. The house free and clear, the better part of the retirement accounts, perhaps a monthly payment for a set period. I want him to struggle, I said bluntly. I want him to understand what it feels like to have your comfortable life ripped away because of someone else's choices. We can make that happen, Patricia assured me. The second part of my plan involved my mother, and it was more emotional than financial. I knew I couldn't hurt her the way she'd hurt me because there was no equivalent. I couldn't sleep with her husband because my father was dead. I couldn't betray her trust because she'd already destroyed all trust between us. But I could take away what mattered most to her, her relationship with her grandchildren. I talked to all three of my kids about it separately, laying out my thoughts. I can't tell you how to feel or what to do, I told each of them. She's your grandmother and you're adults. You get to make your own decisions about whether you want her in your life. But I also made sure they understood the full scope of what she'd done. Not just the affair itself, but the deliberate deception over 13 years. The family dinners where she'd sat across from them, knowing what she was doing to their mother. The holidays where she'd accepted their love and gifts while harboring this secret that would devastate them all. Michael was the first to make his decision. "I'm done with her, Mom," he said, his jaw tight with anger. "I don't care how old she is or that she's family. What she did is unforgivable. I don't want her at my house. I don't want her around my kids. I don't want anything to do with her." Sarah struggled more because she'd always been especially close to her grandmother. But ultimately, she came to the same conclusion. "I can't look at her the same way anymore," she said through tears. "Every memory I have with her is tainted now. I keep thinking about all the times she was there for important moments in my life, and the whole time she was doing this to you. I can't forgive that." Jennifer took the longest to decide, but eventually she agreed. "I want to believe people can change, that forgiveness is possible," she said. "But I also believe in consequences. And if there are no consequences for something this terrible, then what does that say about our values as a family?" So we made a pact. None of us would have contact with my mother. No visits, no calls, no text messages. When she reached out, we'd ignore it. If she showed up at one of their houses, they wouldn't answer the door. She would be cut off from the family she'd helped destroy, and she would have only herself to blame. It felt harsh. It felt cruel. It also felt necessary. The third part of my plan was perhaps the most important. I needed to rebuild my own life in a way that showed Charles and my mother that I didn't need either of them to be happy and whole. This part was harder because it required actually processing the grief instead of just channeling it into anger and revenge. It meant going to therapy, which I started about 3 weeks after the discovery. My therapist, Dr. Sandra Klein, was patient and kind as I worked through the layers of betrayal and loss. "You're grieving multiple things at once," she explained during one session. "You're grieving your marriage, yes, but you're also grieving the mother you thought you had. You're grieving the life you thought you were living. You're even grieving your own identity as a wife and daughter because those roles have been fundamentally changed." She was right. Some days I'd wake up and forget for a moment that my entire life had changed, and then remembering would hit me like a physical blow. Other days, the weight of it was there from the moment I opened my eyes, pressing down on me until it felt hard to breathe. But slowly, very slowly, I started to find small pockets of peace. I joined a book club at the library where I worked. I started taking yoga classes at the community center, something I'd always wanted to try but never made time for. I reconnected with friends I'd lost touch with over the years, women who'd known me before Charles, before marriage and children and all the roles I'd accumulated over a lifetime. I was 63 years old, discovering who Barbara Evans was when she wasn't someone's wife or someone's daughter or someone's mother. It was terrifying and liberating in equal measure. 1 month after the discovery, Patricia served Charles with divorce papers at the shop. He called me immediately, his voice breaking. "Barbara, please, can we talk about this? Don't we owe it to 43 years to try? You should have thought about what you owed those 43 years before you started sleeping with my mother," I said coldly. "Talk to your lawyer, Charles. We have nothing to say to each other." He tried several more times to reach me. showing up at the house once before I threatened to call the police, sending long emails that I deleted without reading. My mother did the same, growing increasingly desperate as the weeks passed and I maintained radio silence. "I'm dying, Barbara," one text message read. "I might not have much time left, and I don't want to leave this world with you hating me." I showed it to Dr. Klein. "Is she manipulating me?" I asked. "Or does she really believe this?" "Probably both," Dr. Klein said. "At 94, the reality of mortality is very present, but that doesn't obligate you to forgive her or reconcile with her. You're allowed to set boundaries that protect your own well-being, even if those boundaries hurt her." The divorce proceeded faster than I'd expected. Charles, perhaps realizing that fighting would only make things worse and might result in the affair becoming public knowledge, agreed to most of Patricia's demands. He kept the business but signed over the house to me completely, plus gave me 60% of our retirement accounts and agreed to pay me a monthly sum for 3 years. "He's essentially buying your silence," Patricia said when he accepted the settlement. "He knows that if this went to trial, details about the affair might become public record. He's willing to pay significantly to keep that from happening." "Good," I said. "Let him pay." The actual divorce was finalized in March of 2018, exactly 5 months after that terrible October day. I sat in the courtroom next to Patricia, with Jennifer on my other side for support, and watched the judge sign the papers that ended my 43-year marriage. Charles was there too, across the room with his lawyer, looking older and more defeated than I'd ever seen him. When our eyes met, I saw regret in his expression, maybe even love. But I felt nothing. That door had closed permanently the moment he'd admitted to 13 years of betrayal. When we left the courthouse, Jennifer hugged me tight. "How do you feel, Mom?" "Free," I said, and realized I meant it. The grief wasn't gone, might never be completely gone, but I was no longer tied to a man who disrespected me so profoundly. I was no longer obligated to protect his feelings or consider his needs. I was just Barbara, starting over at 63, and that felt like exactly what I needed. But I wasn't done yet. There was still one more person who needed to face consequences for what she'd done. Cutting my mother out of my life completely was harder than I'd anticipated, not because I missed her, though some part of me did, the part that remembered the mother she'd been before the betrayal, but because of the practical realities of her age and situation. She was 94 years old, living alone, with no one to help her except the occasional assistance from the staff at Madison Towers. My sister Linda had no intention of leaving Arizona to care for her, had in fact been horrified when I'd told her what happened, and said she wanted nothing to do with either my mother or Charles. So my mother was essentially alone. And while part of me felt that was exactly what she deserved, another part, the part that had spent 63 years being a good daughter, struggled with the guilt of abandonment. Dr. Klein and I worked through this extensively. "You're not responsible for managing the consequences of her choices," she'd remind me. "She made decisions knowing they could destroy your relationship. That's on her, not you." But it didn't feel that simple. Cleveland can be brutal in winter, and I'd catch myself worrying. What if she falls and can't get up? What if she runs out of food? What if she gets sick and there's no one to notice? Then I'd remind myself, she should have thought about that before sleeping with my husband for 13 years. The calls from Madison Towers started about 2 months after the divorce was finalized. The first was from Brenda, the activities coordinator. "Mrs. Evans, I'm calling about your mother. She's been missing meals, staying in her apartment more. We're concerned about her mental health." "I appreciate your concern," I said, keeping my voice neutral. "But I'm no longer involved in my mother's care. If you're worried about her, I suggest you contact social services." "But you're her daughter." "I'm aware of our biological relationship," I interrupted. "But circumstances have changed and I'm no longer able to help her. Thank you for calling. I hung up feeling like a terrible person, which I suppose I was supposed to feel. The staff at Madison Towers didn't know what my mother had done, only saw an elderly woman who'd been abandoned by her family. The calls continued, growing more urgent. My mother had stopped paying her rent. My mother hadn't been seen in several days. My mother was telling staff she wanted to die. Each call was a knife in my heart, but I held firm. This was the consequence of her actions, and I was not going to rescue her from it. 3 months after the divorce, I got a call from a social worker at Metro Health. My mother had been brought in by ambulance after a neighbor found her unconscious in her apartment. She'd had a minor stroke, was stable now, but needed someone to make decisions about her care going forward. I sat in my car outside the library where I'd just finished a shift, staring at my phone, the social worker's number still on the screen. This was it, the moment where I had to decide. Did I step in and resume the role of dutiful daughter, or did I maintain my boundaries, even though it meant my mother might end up in a state facility with minimal care? Jennifer found me like that an hour later, having tracked my phone when I didn't answer her calls. She got in the passenger seat and just sat with me while I cried angry, frustrated tears. "I don't know what to do," I finally said. "I hate her for what she did, but she's my mother. She's 94 years old and had a stroke, and I'm sitting here wondering if I'm supposed to just let her rot in some state-run nursing home." "What do you want to do?" Jennifer asked gently. "Not what you think you should do, not what anyone else expects, but what do you actually want?" I thought about it for a long time. What did I want? "I want her to face consequences," I said finally. "I want her to understand that actions have consequences, that you can't just say you're sorry and have everything go back to normal. But I also don't want to be the kind of person who abandons their elderly mother, even if that mother did something unforgivable." "Those aren't mutually exclusive," Jennifer pointed out. "You can make sure she has adequate care without being personally involved. You can ensure she's safe without forgiving her or resuming a relationship with her." It took me another week to figure out how to do that. I met with the social worker, made it clear I would not be providing hands-on care, but that I would make sure she was placed somewhere appropriate. I toured several nursing facilities in Cleveland, looking for one that was clean and adequately staffed but not luxurious, not the kind of place where she'd be pampered and comfortable. I chose a facility in Brooklyn called Meadowbrook Care Center. It was fine, not terrible, not great, just adequate. Medicare and her Social Security would cover most of it, and I'd supplement the rest from her small savings account and the money she'd get from selling her apartment. I arranged everything through the social worker and the facility administrator. I never saw my mother during any of this. I signed papers, made decisions, ensured she'd be cared for, all while maintaining complete distance. When I told Jennifer, Michael, and Sarah what I'd done, they had mixed reactions. Michael thought I was being too generous. Sarah thought I was doing the right thing. Jennifer just hugged me and said, "I'm proud of you for figuring out what works for you." One evening, about a month after my mother had been moved to Meadowbrook, I was at home when the doorbell rang. I wasn't expecting anyone and approached the door cautiously. Through the peephole, I could see Charles standing on my front porch. I hadn't seen him in person since the courthouse. He looked older, grayer, tired in a way that went beyond physical exhaustion. I opened the door, but didn't invite him in. "What do you want, Charles?" "I need to talk to you," he said. "Please, Barbara, 5 minutes." "You have 3, I said, crossing my arms. "And you're staying right there on the porch." He took a shaky breath. "I know you hate me. You have every right to. But I need you to know that I'm sorry. I'm so sorry for what I did to you, to our marriage, to our family. And I need to tell you that it's over. The thing with Ruth, it's over." I raised an eyebrow. "Congratulations. Do you want a medal for ending your 13-year affair with my mother?" "No, He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture I'd seen 1,000 times over 4 decades. I ended it the day you found out. I haven't seen her or spoken to her since then. I know that doesn't change anything, doesn't make up for what we did, but I wanted you to know. Why? I asked flatly. Why do I need to know that? Do you think it makes me feel better? Do you think knowing you're no longer fucking my mother is going to make me forgive you? He flinched at the crude language, which I never used to use. No, I just thought you should know. And I wanted to tell you that I know you arranged for Ruth to be placed at Meadowbrook. She's angry that you chose that facility. Says it's not nice enough. Something inside me snapped. She's angry? She's 94 years old, recovering from a stroke, with nowhere else to go because she destroyed her relationship with everyone who ever cared about her. And she's angry that the nursing home I'm paying for isn't nice enough. I know, Charles said quickly. I told her the same thing. I told her she has no right to complain about anything, that she's lucky you made sure she was placed somewhere at all. Your 3 minutes are up, I said, moving to close the door. Barbara, wait. He put his hand on the door frame, not aggressively, just desperate to keep me from shutting him out. I know I have no right to ask this, but is there any chance, any possibility at all, that someday you might forgive me? I looked at him for a long moment, this man I'd loved for more than 40 years, who I'd built a life with, who'd given me 3 children and countless memories, both good and bad, and I felt nothing but pity and a lingering sadness for what could have been. No, I said simply, there's not. What you did was unforgivable, Charles. You didn't just betray me. You betrayed our entire family. You chose 13 years of lying and sneaking around over our marriage. And you chose my mother, which makes it so much worse. So no, I will never forgive you. I will move on with my life and hopefully find some measure of peace and happiness. But that will happen in spite of you, not because of any forgiveness or reconciliation. I closed the door while he was still standing there, his face crumpling with grief. I locked it, walked to the living room, and sat down on the couch. And for the first time since that terrible October day, 9 months ago, I didn't cry. I just sat there, feeling the absence of pain, the absence of rage, the absence of grief. Just a quiet emptiness that felt almost peaceful. I was 64 years old, newly divorced, estranged from my mother, starting over in a life I never expected to have. But I was free. And that freedom was worth every painful moment it had taken to get here. The first year after the divorce was a study in contrast. Some days I felt powerful and independent, reveling in my newfound freedom to make decisions based solely on what I wanted. Other days, the loneliness was crushing, coming home to an empty house that echoed with decades of memories now tainted by betrayal. I threw myself into building a new life with the same determination I'd once put into being a good wife and mother. I took up oil painting, something I'd always wanted to try but never had time for. I joined a divorce support group at my church, where I met other women navigating the wreckage of failed marriages. I started volunteering at a literacy program, helping adults learn to read, which gave me a sense of purpose outside my own pain. My children remained supportive, but were also dealing with their own grief about what had happened. Michael struggled with anger, sometimes calling me late at night just to rant about how much he hated Charles and my mother. Sarah went to therapy to process her feelings about her grandmother's betrayal. Jennifer, always the caretaker, worried about me constantly, checking in every day, sometimes stopping by unannounced just to make sure I was okay. The grandchildren were harder. They were young enough that we decided not to tell them the real reason for the divorce and estrangement. We just said that Grandpa Charles and Great-Grandma Ruth had done something that hurt the family very badly, and we needed time apart from them. The kids accepted this with the resilience children have, though I knew there would be questions as they got older. I saw Charles occasionally, usually by accident at the grocery store or driving through town. We'd nod politely if we made eye contact, nothing more. He looked lonely too, though whether that was from losing me or losing my mother or just the general weight of his choices, I couldn't say and didn't care enough to find out. I got updates about my mother through the social workers at Meadowbrook, though I'd made clear I didn't want detailed information. Just the essentials. She was stable, eating, participating in some activities. She'd had a few more minor health issues, but nothing catastrophic. She asked about me constantly, I was told. Wanted to know if I'd visit, if I'd call, if there was any chance of reconciliation. The answer was always no. About 18 months after the divorce, I got a call from the director of Meadowbrook. My mother had fallen and broken her hip, had gone through surgery, but the prognosis wasn't great. At 96, recovering from a broken hip was difficult, and there was a real possibility she wouldn't make it. "Does she want to see you?" I asked the director. "Yes, very much. She keeps asking for you, Mrs. Evans." I sat with that information for several days. This could be it, the last chance to see my mother alive, the last opportunity to say whatever needed to be said before she was gone forever. Jennifer thought I should go. "You might regret it if you don't," she said gently. "Even after everything, she's your mom." Michael thought I shouldn't. "She doesn't deserve to see you," he said firmly. "Let her die alone with her guilt." Sarah was torn. "I don't know what the right answer is, Mom. Only you can decide what you need." Dr. Klein asked me what I wanted to accomplish if I did go. "Are you looking for closure? An apology? Reconciliation? You need to be clear about your expectations because she might not be able to give you what you want, especially if her health is failing." I thought about it for a week, and finally, I decided to go. Not because I owed her anything, not because I'd forgiven her, but because I needed to look her in the eye one more time and tell her exactly what she'd done to me. I needed her to understand, fully and completely, the magnitude of her betrayal before she died. Meadowbrook Care Center was exactly as I'd remembered it. Clean but institutional, the smell of antiseptic and cafeteria food hanging in the air. The director met me in the lobby and led me to my mother's room. She looked tiny in the hospital bed, smaller and more fragile than I'd ever seen her. Her hair, which had been dyed a soft brown for most of my adult life, was now completely white. Her face was gaunt, her skin papery and thin. She had tubes running to her arms and a machine beeping steadily beside her. When she saw me in the doorway, her eyes filled with tears. "Barbara," she whispered, "you came." I pulled a chair up to her bedside but didn't touch her. Didn't take her hand the way I would have done automatically before all of this. "I came to say what I need to say. Not because I've forgiven you or because we're reconciling. You need to understand that." She nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I understand." "Do you?" I asked, keeping my voice steady. "Do you understand what you did to me? Not just the affair itself, though that's bad enough. Do you understand that you betrayed me in the most fundamental way possible? You gave birth to me, raised me, told me you loved me, and then you slept with my husband for 13 years. 13 years, Mom. That's longer than some marriages last." "I know," she whispered. "I know it was wrong. I've known it was wrong from the very beginning." "Then why?" I demanded, my voice rising despite my efforts to stay calm. "Why did you do it? Why did you keep doing it for 13 years? Why did you look me in the eye at family dinners and birthday parties and holidays while you were actively betraying me?" She was quiet for a long moment, struggling to find words. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely audible, "Because I was lonely, and he made me feel alive again in a way I hadn't felt since your father died. And I know that's not an excuse, Barbara. I know it doesn't make it okay." "You're right," I interrupted. "It doesn't make it okay. You were lonely. I was right here. I visited you constantly. I took you shopping. I made sure you had everything you needed. If you needed more companionship, you could have joined a club, made friends, found a boyfriend your own age. You didn't have to sleep with my husband." "I know," she said again, the tears coming faster now. I know. There's nothing I can say that will make this better. But please, Barbara, please, I need you to know that I love you. I have always loved you. What I did was terrible and wrong, but my love for you was never a lie." I stood up, my hands shaking with rage. "Your love was absolutely a lie. Real love doesn't do what you did. Real love doesn't destroy its own daughter for 13 years while pretending everything is fine. Real love has boundaries and loyalty and basic human decency." "Barbara, I'm not done," I said harshly. "You need to hear this before you die. You need to understand that you didn't just hurt me. You destroyed our entire family. Your grandchildren don't want to know you anymore. Michael won't even speak your name. Sarah goes to therapy because of what you did. Jennifer has trust issues now, wondering if anyone can be believed if her own grandmother could betray her mother like this." My mother was sobbing now, her frail body shaking with each cry. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Please, Barbara, please forgive me." "No," I said flatly. "I will not forgive you. I came here to tell you that what you did was unforgivable, and I wanted you to understand that before you die. I wanted you to know that you're going to leave this world with me hating you, and that's what you deserve." I turned to leave, but her voice, weak and desperate, stopped me. "Barbara, wait, please. I'm begging you. I can't die like this with you hating me, please. I need—" I turned back to look at her one last time. "What you need stopped mattering to me the day I found out what you did. Goodbye, Mother. I hope whatever happens after this life includes you facing the full weight of what you've done." I walked out of that room and didn't look back. I made it to my car before the tears came. Great heaving sobs that shook my entire body. Not because I regretted what I'd said or because I'd forgiven her, but because it was really over now. That door was permanently closed. My mother died 3 days later. The facility called to inform me, asked about funeral arrangements. I told them to contact the state, that I wouldn't be handling her burial or memorial service. Michael and Sarah both called to ask if I was okay. "I'm fine," I told them honestly. I said what I needed to say. I don't regret it. Jennifer was quieter, more uncertain. "Mom, was it the right thing? To be so harsh with her when she was dying?" "I don't know if it was right," I admitted, "but it was honest. And after 13 years of lies, honesty was what she deserved, even if it wasn't kind." Charles called too, somehow having heard about my mother's death. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. "I heard about Ruth," he said quietly. "I'm sorry, Barbara. I know things were complicated between you two, but losing your mother is still hard." "Don't," I said sharply. "Don't pretend to comfort me when you're part of the reason she and I were estranged. You don't get to play the supportive ex-husband now. I just wanted you to know. I don't care what you wanted me to know, Charles. Stop calling me. Stop showing up. I've moved on with my life, and you need to respect that." I hung up and blocked his number. I should have done it months ago. The state handled my mother's burial in a simple ceremony I didn't attend. A few of her friends from Madison Towers were there, I heard later, and one cousin I barely knew. That was it. A 96-year-old woman who'd lived through nearly a century, raised a family, loved and lost, reduced to a handful of mourners who barely knew her. Maybe that was sad. Maybe I should have felt something about it, but mostly I just felt relief that it was finally, completely over. The second year after the divorce was better than the first. Not because the pain went away, it didn't, not completely, but because I learned to build a life around it rather than being consumed by it. I started dating again at 65, which felt both terrifying and exciting. Nothing serious at first. Just coffee or dinner with men I met through the library or my painting class or the divorce support group. It was strange to navigate dating at this age, to try to figure out the rules when the last time I'd done this, I was a teenager. Some of the men I met were bitter about their own divorces, still carrying anger toward their ex-wives like a shield. I avoided those men. Others were sweet but boring, nice enough but lacking any spark. I went on second dates with a few of them but never third dates. Then I met Frank DiCarlo at a community art show where I'd submitted one of my paintings. He was 72, a retired English teacher, widowed 5 years earlier. He had kind eyes and made me laugh, which I hadn't done genuinely in longer than I could remember. We started as friends, meeting for coffee once a week to talk about books and art and our respective families. He knew I was divorced, but not the details, and I liked that he didn't press for information I wasn't ready to share. 6 months into our friendship, during one of our weekly coffee dates, he asked me to dinner. A real dinner, with a reservation and flowers, making it clear this was a date rather than just two friends meeting up. "I like you, Barbara," he said, with an honesty I appreciated. "And I think you might like me too. I'm not looking to rush into anything, but I'd like to see if there's something here worth exploring." I said yes, surprising myself with how much I meant it. We dated slowly, carefully, both of us aware of our age and our respective baggage. He told me about his late wife, Nancy, and how losing her had nearly broken him. I told him about Charles and the betrayal, though I left out the part about it being my mother. That detail still felt too raw, too personal to share even with someone I was growing to care about. Frank never pushed for more than I was willing to give, emotionally or physically. When we finally kissed, 8 months into dating, it felt natural and right in a way that made me realize I'd almost forgotten what healthy affection felt like. "I don't know if I can ever get married again," I told him one evening, feeling like I needed to be upfront about my limitations. "After 43 years and how it ended, I just don't think I can trust like that again." "I'm not asking you to," Frank assured me. "I had my marriage, and it was good while it lasted. I'm just enjoying getting to know you and seeing where this goes. No expectations, no pressure." It was exactly what I needed. Meanwhile, the kids were doing better too. Michael had started seeing a therapist to work through his anger, and it was helping. Sarah seemed lighter, more at peace with what had happened. Jennifer had started dating again too, something she'd been hesitant to do because she'd been so focused on taking care of me. We had a family dinner one Sunday, all 3 kids and their families plus Frank, who I'd been nervous to introduce, but who charmed everyone immediately with his stories about teaching high school English and the ridiculous things students had written in their essays over the years. After dinner, when everyone had gone home and it was just Frank and me cleaning up, he asked the question I'd been dreading. "Barbara, can I ask you something personal?" "That depends on how personal," I said, scraping leftover mashed potatoes into a container. "Your ex-husband, Charles, you've never really talked about what he did. You just say he was unfaithful and that it was bad enough to end a 43-year marriage. But I get the feeling there's more to it than that." I set down the container and leaned against the counter, debating how much to tell him. We'd been dating for over a year now. He'd met my children, spent time in my home, become an important part of my new life. If this was going anywhere, he deserved to know the truth. "The affair was with my mother," I said quietly. "For 13 years. Frank's face went through several emotions: shock, disbelief, disgust, and finally a deep sadness. "Oh, Barbara. Oh my God, I'm so sorry. I don't even have words." "Most people don't," I said. "It's not exactly a common situation." He pulled me into a hug, and I let myself lean into him, grateful for the solid comfort of someone who cared about me with no ulterior motives. "No wonder you have trust issues," he said gently. "I can't even imagine how you survived something like that." "Some days I'm not sure I did," I admitted. "But I'm here, and I'm building something new, and that has to count for something. It counts for everything, Frank said firmly. You're one of the strongest people I've ever met. I didn't feel particularly strong. I felt tired and sometimes still angry, and occasionally so sad I could barely function. But I also felt hopeful in a way I hadn't expected to feel again. Frank represented possibility, the idea that life could continue, could even be good, despite the worst kind of betrayal. 2 years turned into 3, and then 3 into 4. I celebrated my 68th birthday surrounded by my children, grandchildren, and Frank in a house that now felt like mine, rather than a museum of a failed marriage. I'd redecorated entirely, getting rid of furniture Charles and I had picked out together, painting walls in colors he'd never liked, making the space reflect who I was becoming, rather than who I'd been. Charles got remarried, I heard through mutual acquaintances. Some woman he'd met at a car show, 15 years younger than him, childless, and apparently unbothered by his history. Good for her, I thought, without any real feeling about it one way or another. His life had nothing to do with mine anymore. I'd occasionally wonder what would have happened if I'd never followed him that day, if I'd never discovered the truth. Would they still be together? Would I still be living in ignorant bliss, thinking I had a good marriage and a devoted mother? The thought was simultaneously comforting and horrifying. But more often, I found myself grateful for the discovery, as painful as it had been, because living in a lie, even a comfortable one, was no way to live. The truth had destroyed my old life, yes, but it had also freed me to build a new one based on authenticity rather than illusion. And that new life, despite all the pain it had taken to get here, was pretty damn good. On what would have been my mother's 100th birthday, I did something I hadn't done in 4 years. I visited her grave. I'd never been to her burial site before, hadn't even known where it was until I'd asked the funeral home that handled her state-funded service. They'd given me the location of a small cemetery in Brooklyn, not far from where Meadowbrook had been. I drove there on a cold November morning, parking near the section where she was buried. It took me a while to find her grave because the headstone was small and plain, just her name and dates. Ruth Morrison, 1920-2018. I stood there for a long time, looking at that stone, trying to feel something significant. Grief, anger, forgiveness, anything. But mostly I just felt tired. I don't know why I came here, I said out loud, feeling slightly ridiculous talking to a headstone. I don't forgive you. I don't think I ever will. What you did was unforgivable. The cemetery was quiet except for the wind rustling through the bare trees. But I also don't hate you anymore, I continued. I did for a long time. I hated you so much it felt like it was eating me alive from the inside. But carrying that much hate was exhausting, and eventually I had to let it go for my own sanity. I knelt down and cleared some leaves away from the base of the headstone, a gesture that surprised me even as I did it. You were a good mother for a long time, I said quietly. Before all this, before the betrayal, you were the person I trusted most in the world. And I think that's what hurt the most. Not just what you did, but that it was you who did it. If it had been anyone else, it would have been terrible but survivable. But my own mother, that broke something in me that I don't think will ever be completely fixed. I stood up, brushing dirt from my knees. I hope wherever you are now, you understand what you did and why it was so wrong. I hope you found some kind of peace, even though I couldn't give you forgiveness before you died. And I hope that you know, despite everything, there was a time when I loved you more than anyone in the world. That was real, even if everything else became a lie. I walked back to my car without looking back, feeling lighter somehow. Not forgiven, not reconciled, but perhaps released from the weight of active hatred that I'd been carrying for so long. Frank was waiting for me at home with soup and bread, having insisted I shouldn't be alone after visiting the grave. We sat in my kitchen, the same kitchen where I'd confronted Charles and my mother 4 years earlier, and he held my hand while I cried quiet tears that had nothing to do with grief and everything to do with letting go. "Are you okay?" he asked gently. "I will be," I said. "I am, it's complicated." "Feelings usually are," he agreed. That night, lying in bed next to Frank, who'd started staying over more often, though we'd maintained separate residences, I thought about forgiveness and what it meant. I'd never forgive my mother or Charles for what they'd done. That door was permanently closed, and I'd made my peace with that. But I'd also learned that you don't have to forgive someone to move on from them. You can acknowledge the hurt, feel the anger, process the grief, and still build a new life that has nothing to do with the person who hurt you. Forgiveness, I'd learned, wasn't the only path to peace. Sometimes acceptance was enough. Acceptance that it happened, that it was terrible, that it changed me in fundamental ways, and that I was okay anyway. I was 68 years old, in a relationship with a man who treated me with kindness and respect, surrounded by children and grandchildren who loved me, living in a home that reflected who I was rather than who someone else wanted me to be. I'd survived the unthinkable. And not just survived. I'd built something good from the wreckage. That was enough. I'm 70 now, sitting in the living room of the house that's entirely mine, looking back on 3 years since my mother's death and 7 years since the discovery that changed everything. Life has a way of moving forward whether you're ready or not, and I've learned to move with it rather than against it. Frank and I are still together, happily unmarried and likely to stay that way. We split our time between his place and mine, traveling when we feel like it, enjoying a companionship that has no agenda beyond mutual respect and affection. We went to Italy last spring, something I'd always wanted to do but never had the chance. We spent 2 weeks wandering through Florence and Rome and Venice, holding hands like teenagers and eating gelato in piazzas while the sun set over ancient buildings. My children are thriving. Michael finally worked through most of his anger and actually reconnected with Charles recently, though their relationship will never be what it was. Sarah got engaged to a wonderful man who treats her like she hung the moon. Jennifer's kids are growing up so fast it makes my heart ache in the best possible way. None of them have any contact with Charles's new wife or her family. That bridge was burned beyond repair, and we're all okay with that. Family, I've learned, is about more than biology. It's about trust and loyalty and showing up for each other, none of which Charles did for us when it mattered most. I still paint, and I've actually gotten pretty good at it. I had a piece accepted into a local art show last year, which felt like a small but significant victory for the woman I've become. I still volunteer at the literacy program, still attend book club, still go to yoga even though my knees complain more than they used to. Sometimes I think about what my life might have looked like if the betrayal had never happened. I'd probably still be with Charles, probably still having weekly dinners with my mother, probably still living in that comfortable delusion that I had a good marriage and a close family. And I'd be missing all of this. The freedom, the self-discovery, the knowledge that I can survive the worst kind of betrayal and come out stronger on the other side. I don't recommend the path I took to get here. Nobody should have to go through what I went through, but I also can't regret where I ended up. If you're listening to this story and you're going through your own betrayal, your own heartbreak, your own moment where the life you thought you had turned out to be a lie, I want you to know something. It's okay to not be okay. It's okay to be angry and hurt and to feel like you'll never recover. It's okay to set boundaries that other people think are too harsh. It's okay to cut people out of your life, even family, if that's what you need to heal. But I also want you to know that recovery is possible, not in the tidy, everything goes back to normal way, because it won't. You'll be different after something like this. But different doesn't mean broken. Different can mean stronger, more authentic, more aligned with who you really are, rather than who you thought you were supposed to be. It's never too late to start over. I was 63 when my life fell apart, and I built something new from the ruins. You can too, whatever your age, whatever your circumstances. The most important lesson I learned through all of this is that you don't need other people's forgiveness or approval to move forward. You don't need closure from the person who hurt you. You don't need them to understand or acknowledge or apologize. You just need to decide that you're worth more than the pain they caused, and then you need to start building a life that reflects that truth. I hope my story helps someone out there who's going through something similar. I hope it reminds you that you're not alone, that betrayal doesn't have to be the end of your story, and that there's life and joy and possibility on the other side of even the worst heartbreak. If you've made it this far in my story, thank you for listening. Thank you for being here, for caring enough about an old woman's tale of betrayal and survival to stick with it to the end. If this resonated with you at all, I'd be so grateful if you'd hit that like button and leave a comment telling me what you thought or where you're watching from. And if you haven't already, please subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications, because there are so many more stories like mine from women who've survived the unthinkable and came out stronger. Your support helps these stories reach people who need to hear them, and I can't thank you enough for that. My name is Barbara Ann Evans. I'm 70 years old. I live in Cleveland, Ohio, and I survived my husband's 13-year affair with my own mother. But more importantly, I built a whole new life afterward, and that life is pretty wonderful. It's never too late to start over. It's never too late to choose yourself. It's never too late to be happy. Thank you for letting me share my story with you. I wish you all peace, healing, and the courage to build the life you deserve.